Welcome to Zen Bites, a series of audio recordings on Zen Buddhism, psychology, mindfulness meditation and spirituality, featuring Martin Goodson, a Buddhist meditation teacher, and Jamie Shavdia, a mindfulness-based psychotherapist. The following conversation was recorded in April 2015 in association with the website thezengateway.com and Jamie's own website, jamieshavdia.co.uk. So if it's time to take a break, sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. Okay, welcome to Zen Bites 11. Today we're going to be talking about sitting meditation, also known in the Zen tradition as Zazen. And hopefully we're going to then take the conversation into, we'll look at the historical origins at first, and maybe a little bit about why we do it, and then branch out into more practical areas of kind of how you can go about doing this and indeed why as well. So Martin, maybe we can start off with just explaining a little bit about what seated meditation is and perhaps why is it so important.
Well, it's obviously a very big subject, and particularly in the Zen school, because the word Zen actually is a Japanese word. Obviously, comes from the Chinese Chan, and Chan itself comes from the Sanskrit dhyana, which means meditation, and it specifically refers to the practice of meditation. When you come into Buddhism, in fact, there are lots of words that mean meditation, like bhavana and so forth, and other words like sati, etc., that are connected with it. But dhyana is very much pointing towards the practice of seated meditation. And because of this, the Zen school used to be called the meditation school. And the view was that it was really all about meditation. Interestingly enough, there's still, certainly in the West, when you pick up books on Buddhism, on Zen Buddhism, there's still a strong emphasis on sitting meditation. And I know quite a lot of people who come to, for example, a Buddhist society are quite surprised, if they've done some Zen meditation before, that is such a thing called daily life practice. For them, it's about sitting on retreats, sessions as they're called, and it's about sitting at home and sitting in a group, at your local temple or Dharma centre, and that's it. Apart from that, you just carry on with your life as normal, and it pretty much doesn't affect anything else apart from this very specific practice. It's almost like just doing a prayer, and then you finish it and then you just carry on.
Almost isolated in that respect.
Almost isolated, and this isn't just a Western view. It was a view that arose in China as well, and eventually became what was called quietism, obviously because it meant people sitting quietly, cross-legged, and in fact this was very much railed against in the Zen tradition, and in the end quietism died out, because it couldn't take in the rest of daily life, and it seemed to it just wasn't enough. So that's so to speak why Zen itself gets its name, but also the importance that the Zen school does place on sitting meditation. It is important, but it's not the whole story, obviously.
Yes, and I know you mentioned this earlier, but just to be clear for our listeners then, so if we follow this sort of historical development of Buddhism, so dhyana is essentially an Indian term,
yes,
which
it
is where obviously Buddhism started. And
that's right.
Back in 2,600 years ago, and Buddhism essentially moved from India into other parts of Asia, and then obviously in modern day it's come to the West and so on. But before that, it's moved down into Sri Lanka and Thailand, where it became kind of Theravadan Buddhism, and then it moved over through into China, and became Chan Buddhism, and then eventually made its way over into Japan and became Zen.
That was one. Just to say, that's one lineage. Obviously, there were several Chinese schools. Obviously, it moved north into Tibet as well, of course,
and fused with the Bon religion.
Absolutely.
And I think this is why Buddhism often does look so different. You often hear this idea of Buddhism is like water. The essence of it is kind of one thing, and that it then fulfills the traditions of different countries that are pre-existing there already. So as you said, with the Tibetan situation, you had Bon religion, which is a very sort of colourful religion, which is why you see sort of Tibetan Buddhism is quite colourful in terms of its aesthetics.
Yeah.
Whereas Zen, as it moved through into Japan, it met with a slightly more austere, slightly more samurai-like.
Well, it's interesting enough when the British Raj, when they came across Buddhism, they liked Theravadan Buddhism because it seemed more Protestant to them. When they came across Mahayana Buddhism, by which they meant more the Tibetan schools, they regarded that with great suspicion. They thought it was all about superstition because it looked too Catholic.
Yes.
So, yes, we always interpret these things with our own categories. But yes, that's it. Okay. Interesting. Just to say, of course, and you're right that these different schools, meditation isn't just something that the Zen schools do. It goes right back to the Buddha. I mean, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha speaks in a small sutta, in a small scripture called the Satipatthana, which translates as the foundations of awareness or foundations of mindfulness. And he gives the instructions for sitting meditation in there. But at the same time, he also gives the instruction for meditation in activities, what we call daily life practice too.
So there's the idea of seated meditation, standing, movement in general, lying down.
Yes.
And what was the other one?
Sitting, standing, walking, lying down.
Lying down, yes.
Yes.
So if this goes right back to that Indian term of dhyana, which means meditation, we can see why meditation does form such a huge part of Buddhism, and now in more Western psychological circles as meditation itself. So I think it's important to say, as we're exploring the history of all of this, is that even meditation itself is not exclusive to Buddhism even.
No, not at all.
Hinduism is almost 5,000 years old, and which greatly precedes Buddhism, and of course one would argue that the Buddha himself was probably a Hindu.
Well, he was originally.
And
just sorry to interrupt again, but just to say on that part, because actually that's a very important point. A little bit like Jesus was Jewish as well. The Buddha actually, from the Buddha's point of view, even a lot of the doctrines that he took from Hinduism, things like the Wheel of Life, karma, the three fires, and so forth. But he gave them a Buddhist spin, which is often happens. The innovators in religion don't create something brand new out of nothing.
Yes.
They take something and they reinterpret it in an innovative fashion and
through their own insight.
But this is what the Buddha did, because it's very difficult to have a completely clean break like that. You don't necessarily want it if you're talking to people. You need to talk to them in categories they understand.
Absolutely, and the same thing happens in psychology. I mean, even if you look at the development of psychoanalysis, of course, Carl Jung was Sigmund Freud's protege, and almost sort of Freud as a bit of a father at one point.
Very much.
And he was very much a psychoanalyst, but after a while started to realise that the sexual theory was not perhaps as complete and the whole story, and he obviously had a very spiritual arm to his thinking.
Yes.
And through his own quite profound realisations, I think at the end of the Second World War, he formed analytical psychology.
Yes.
And it did have elements of psychoanalysis in Freud's school there, but clearly became very spiritual, and it's something that we you can actually see. Our own teacher Yoko Ono was quite a big fan of Carl Jung.
Very influenced, So, and she used that, and she was interested precisely because she was looking for something to bridge the gap between Buddhism and the Western thinking.
Yes,
as well.
Okay, so back to seated meditation
yes.
then. Somewhat of an interesting tangent, I hope, for our listeners. So just from that then, so perhaps we can say that seated meditation as a term is very much a term of sort of the plural term, and maybe different people doing different meditations could be doing very different things in the seated posture.
Yes.
So some people might be doing mantra meditation, tantric practices, spinal breathing, and so forth. But I think today we're going to exclusively focus on Zazen from the Japanese Zen school.
Tradition, yeah.
So do you want to perhaps say a little bit about what makes Zazen and
Okay.
not something else?
Well, I mean, perhaps just to begin with, Buddhism in all its schools, the practice of meditation, seated meditation in all Buddhist schools, falls into two categories, which I think we've mentioned in previous podcasts. The first part is usually a breath-based meditation, either the breath itself or a count on the breath, something like that. It's a quietening meditation, and then
please see Zen Bites 10 for a podcast on this issue.
Absolutely. And then the second part of it is insight meditation. And usually this means taking up the themes of the Buddha's teachings in one way, shape or form. Whether it's obviously in Zen, it's either koans or it may be other sayings. Actually, in Soto Zen, they don't, they do sometimes use koans in Soto Zen, but quite often they simply just rely on just sitting. And this is because Master Dogen gave a wonderful sermon on why we sit Zazen. Because obviously that's another question. Why do we sit meditation? We sit, and Dogen said to his students, he said, if you think you're going to become enlightened by sitting Zazen, then look at the Buddha statues on the altar. They're all sitting Zazen, most of them are. But Buddhas are already enlightened, so why would they be sitting Zazen if they're already enlightened, if that's what Zazen was about? And he went on to say, it's because we don't sit Zazen to become enlightened. We sit Zazen, we sit in meditation because that's what Buddhas do. We are Buddhas anyway, we just lack the realization of that. So we sit meditation in order to realize what we are anyway.
So essentially you're modelling the behaviour of a Buddha, and in that respect you slowly become one over time.
Become aware of what one is anyway. That's the important thing, and actually it filters right the way down, because in the practice of Zazen it's not about changing myself. It's, so to speak, about realizing what we are anyway. There's an old saying that says, when it's all over, the eyes are still horizontal, the nose is still vertical. In other words, there's no heavenly trumpets and flights of angels or anything. It's just realizing our true nature. It doesn't, in that sense, it doesn't change us. Of course, there is a change, because as soon as one realizes, if one has an insight into something, that changes our behavior. But it's essentially nothing changes, because we're no different from Buddhas anyway.
But we come out of the chaos of the thinking mind, and I think maybe this is probably quite a good point just to kind of look at the sort of the modern psychological needs of people in contemporary societies. I'm sure most people are starting to realise that with this kind of pervasive complexity of modern technology that we're seeing now, iPads, iPhones, smartphones, computers everywhere, that very rarely do you actually have time to actually go inside and switch off. And the brain is sort of in high flux all of the time. It's kind of constantly jumping from one thought to another. And even though this issue of the mind being like a monkey that swings from tree to tree has been an issue for aeons. I mean, this was recognised 2,600 years ago or more. However, you could say that the situation is almost worse now, because we're becoming so addicted to technology and it's fluttering around so much that it's so easy to fall into that addiction, and most people aren't even aware that that's happening. Not to mention the pull of advertising and TV and everything else. So this idea of sort of shutting off from all of this in an appropriate space where you can go deeply inside and focus on something as simple as the breath. I mean, the breath is not very interesting, it's actually rather uneventful. But what it does do is it can take that fluctuating sense of attention and consciousness that sits behind the thinking to a certain level of stillness. And that, of course, won't happen straight away. And I know the Mindfulness Association are very big advocates on this idea of seated meditation following the 4 areas of settling, grounding, resting and support, which is allowing the mind to settle at first with the breath, So just following the breath to allow the mind to settle, because when you first sit Zazen, if you say you're coming for a group sitting, for example, even sitting at home, and you've been out at work all day, your mind is naturally all over the place because that's what brains do at work. So you have to allow the mind to settle, and it's not Jamie, or it's not Martin that settles the mind. The mind has to settle of itself, like sediment or soil in a pond. So we allow the mind to settle, and then use the body, almost like what they would refer to as the body scan now, to ground ourselves, become more the body. And if you do that for long enough, everything can settle down to a point where we can simply just rest in that awareness. And then, of course, the final part is then to use the mindfulness, what's called the mindfulness supports, which is breath, body, again, or sound, external sounds, to come back to that awareness should we drift off.
Yes. And that's cultivating the new habit. I mean, as it's put in the Dhammapada, the Buddha explained in the Dhammapada that these objects of meditation are the tethering posts for wild rutting elephants, describing the mind. And of course our minds can be like wild rutting elephants when you come in from a busy day, and particularly if it's fairly fraught. And so it needs that habit of settling down. And you're right, nowadays we often deny that. We deny that possibility, which is why putting aside a period of time for this practice has become so important. And as well as that, having the space and the environment within which to practice it is so important. So, having a chair or a cushion and a shrine when one sits by oneself. Obviously I know some people who can have the luxury of dedicating a whole room to it because they have a spare bedroom. But most people can't do that. But even just a corner of a room, can be helped, because as you approach it, psychologically, your heart and your mind readies itself for what you're about to do. It sees that, it takes these stimuli.
There's an association.
The association over time, which builds up. And of course, the other thing which is hugely supportive as well is if you can sit with a group.
Yes.
I know people, obviously, if you live in a place like London, it's pretty easy to find a group to sit with, and to do that once a week is terrific. It's not only is it a good discipline, it also, again, readies you, and you can do a lot more. You can put up with a lot more with a group than if you're sitting on your own. It's very easy to become distracted.
Wriggle out of it.
Yeah, but even people who sit further away, even I know people who are with our group, for example, but will sit with a local meditation group, wherever they live, maybe a very generalist group. Doesn't matter. The point is there is strength in numbers. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same thing kind of works, I guess, with anything like dieting and stuff like that. If you've got other people around you that are doing it, you'll stick to it.
Absolutely, which is why you go to your meetings once a week.
And get on the scales
and all that. Which is a ritual.
Yes.
It's a whole ritual.
And a pressure in a way, but one that works for you.
One that works for you in the longer term, which is what you're committed to. And again, the other thing, just say a little bit about sort of setting up a shrine. Having a Buddha image there. If you're a Buddhist, having a Buddha image there, because the Buddha represents the ideal. These are the teachings. So every time you stand before it and bow, you're rededicating yourself to the aim, to the commitment. You lighting a candle, lighting some incense. All these things do have a very positive effect for motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. If you are, however, doing seated meditation on your own, because even if you sit with a group, that will tend to be maybe once a week, or if you're lucky, twice a week. Serious meditators will tend to sit on a daily basis.
Yes.
How do you think that varies for them, sort of between a beginner and a more advanced practitioner?
Well, certainly at the beginning, you need a bit more help. It's remarkable when you begin. You can easily be put off because after the initial sort of enthusiasms died down a little bit, as you say, meditating on the breath can become boring
and frustrating,
and very frustrating. And if I see that as an obstacle to meditation, then very quickly I realise it's too big an obstacle, and it can put me off. Whereas actually those things are excellent teachers, because learning to sit with negative thoughts, learning to sit with boredom and other emotional states that come up is very much part and parcel of developing stamina in a meditative practice.
And therefore resilience.
What Ayakima, who was a Theravadan nun, she was German by birth, used to call meditation muscle, which I think is really good. If you think about that, when you go to the gym and you do weight training or stamina sports like running, you start small, you build up. And you have to keep stretching it a little bit more every so often to increase the fitness. There's actually a great deal of similarity in that, and also with mind training as well.
Absolutely. I mean, within all of my groups, that is always the analogy that I point back to, is the one of fitness. And then second best analogy to that would be learning a musical instrument.
Yes.
We all. I mean, you can do it with many.
You're going to be talking about your violin training again.
No, well, it does seem to be quite an accurate thing at the moment. But yeah, the point is that one has to go through a lot of frustration in order to reach any goal. And when you choose a goal, you essentially choose, or in parallel, you choose discomfort. And ironically, with Buddhism, we are aiming essentially to look at the folly of desire. However, especially at the beginning, when we're uninitiated to these things, one would immediately think that there is certainly something to be had or some kind of goal.
Yes.
And I guess it's a kind of a strange area, because of course there is something to be gained, but it's not necessarily in the same way that you might think of your usual materialistic things.
No, because and that has to do with the grasping. If the mind or the heart mind is grasping at something, is grasping at a goal, it interferes with the practice itself. And actually, in many ways, again, to use the sporting analogy, that's exactly what top tennis players also say. When they're on the court, if they're thinking about the prize and winning, it gets in their way of performance, and it's exactly the same on the cushion as well. I was just thinking actually that because you were going to say something about the difficulty, perhaps you could say a little bit more about some of the difficulties people feel now. This idea of building up stamina and concentration and the ability to have that consistency of heart-mind and some of the difficulties you've encountered in your work.
Well, I think certainly something you hear over and over again is how people they love sitting in the group because they have that support, and even though they like sitting at home, they often come up against themselves, and then all the excuses start. So I didn't have time, and the brain creates 100 different reasons of why they couldn't sit, but when actually they haven't really appreciated the fact that the mind itself, the excuse maker, has to settle. And I think that's a key life-changing moment when you realise that you are not your thoughts, and you are not the thing in your head that makes the excuses. You have to put your body in a certain posture, in a certain way, and do that process and have that resistance against the mind. Your mind will come out with a whole load of lies, and you just let it go, and then eventually the mind will settle. And with that comes the wisdom, and that wisdom will happen because it's already there. So again, this comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, that this is coming back to our natural Buddha nature, or the way that we naturally are, if you don't want to use the Buddhist terminology. Is not something that's gained, it's something that is uncovered. It's a realisation of what's already there.
Exactly.
Because the thinking mind, and you could also perhaps say even the emotional field, sometimes blocks that because there's so much activity that the clarity of the consciousness itself is muddied, and we have to a certain extent, you have to understand the behaviour of the thinker and stuff like that. And of course, that is very much advocated by sort of secular mindfulness, realising the manipulative nature of the mind and so on. Very, very, very important. However, if you are a serious meditator and you go on retreats and so on, eventually, and I hope this is the case for our listeners at some point in their lives, they will come to a point where the mind and the body experiences something that is even beyond that. that there is a clarity that comes up, an opening up, which almost it's so strong that it can almost overwhelm the thinker. So the thinker kind of for a while falls away and quietens down so much that you can then, even at the end of a meditational sit, you can get up and participate into your daily life practice with that there, which is unfortunately, I would imagine, outside of the grasp of many people who just dabble.
I think so. I mean, there's it's almost like having been wedded for so long to that thinker and to my thoughts that I see myself as the, so to speak, the hub of all that.
Yeah.
And then suddenly to realise that hub too is just a thought. Yeah. And then that falls away. But what remains is this clarity. Interesting, when the thinker returns, then after that, the thinker is seen in terms as the clarity. Suddenly it's almost like everything's turned around 180 degrees. Because instead of I being in charge of the meditation, it's almost as if suddenly the meditation is in charge of me. The shoe gets firmly put onto the other foot, and everything, we return to the world, we return into the thinking process and the mental processes, but they are, so to speak, being reflected on a much vaster background, on a much vaster canvas, so to speak. And these things are seen, well, like literally like colours on a pond that arise and pass away. And if what strikes is the ephemeral nature of these. So there's when we're talking about the Buddha's teachings of things like impermanence and so forth and emptiness, it's seen in that way. It's not that anything fundamentally has changed. Blue is still blue and red is still red, and fire still burns you and all that sort of thing. But it's the totality within which all these things are seen that suddenly now is added, and there's a sort of there's a sense of wholeness, which is a quality to things. Even small everyday things have that sense of wholeness about them, and it is a very different experience. And of course, and that generally is in the practices of meditation. That generally, certainly for the Rinzai schools, this is where the koan training is used, and in other schools, such as the Theravadan schools, they will concentrate very much on, the Buddha's teachings, like the skandhas and dhatus and the 12-link chain and so forth. And each school has its own particular methods. As I've said, the Soto generally stick with just sitting, but there are various devices that are used to, shall we say, trigger or initiate these wisdoms, and then really it's a matter. These wisdoms have been systematized so that the various stages take you deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's really just a matter of how far you go is down to capacity and time and usually fortunate circumstances coming across the right teachers.
well, yeah, if your karma has it, yeah. So. Just going back to what you were saying about, because I think this is important for our listeners, is that in seated meditation,
yes,
and with everything that's going on in society at the moment, and just the general human vulnerability anyway, it's very, very hard for the mind to get to that real still place. And we have to develop this sense of stamina so we can be resilient against the ways of the mind. Maybe, I know it's almost enshrouded in myth, but maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the great meditators like Daikokuji and Bodhidharma.
Well, yes. I mean, talking of Bodhidharma, he is legendary in all senses of the term. But yes, of course, according to the story, Bodhidharma sat for 9 years facing a wall in a cave. And he said that he sat for so long his legs rotted away, and in fact in Japan you get these sort of what are called the Daruma Dolls. These are weighted at the bottom,
like eggs almost.
Like eggs. They're sort of egg shaped, but they're painted to look like Daruma is just a short nickname for Bodhidharma, and if you push him over he springs back up, and this is and the whole thing about the legs falling off, it's should not be taken literally, but it has to do with this question of resilience that you mentioned earlier. this ability to spring back, so that no matter how far and how often the mind wanders, it can be brought back again, and it becomes a really ingrained habit. And again, we talked about setting up a good meditation place and sitting with a group, but in the end, the Zen masters used to test what they call their Zazen strength. Daito Kokushi was said to have sat for 20 years under the fifth bridge in Kyoto, and that was the main bridge in and out of the city, so it was very noisy. All the beggars lived underneath. It was a tumultuous, chaotic place, and he would practice Zazen there, and he expected his students to be able to do that, because he said if you can't sit Zazen here, then basically you're not up to much. I think Rinzai, he used to go out into the snows, and he would sit Zazen in the snows, and one night a year in the depths of winter, he would test his Zazen strength by staying out all night, and it said that the wolves would jump over him thinking he was a rock. And if he flinched or reacted in any way, they would realise that he was prey and they would go for him. So you get all these sort of stories which sound a little bit frightening, but they're really just ways of showing the need to build up that strength, and this is done over a period of time.
And that's very important and very interesting, because obviously when we start off and we're very vulnerable and our minds are all over the place, you do need the support of a group and so on, and you'll have your quiet room with a candle and so on. But as that strength builds, it's nice to know that actually on a more serious line of development, you actually do need to go into noisy areas and be able to keep that strength there without it being essentially manipulated by all the bells and whistles that are trying to pull you away. In your own head and outside.
Absolutely, and it's a wonderful thing. Once it has become a habit, you go out, you're standing in a supermarket queue, you're standing waiting for a lift or sitting on a bus, and you can return back to that quietness, whenever you want to, whenever you need to, whenever it actually occurs to you, and to revisit that quietness, that spaciousness that opens up in deep meditation as often as possible, and then it becomes second nature. And the interesting thing is that, and you know it, because what you find is that you become less reactive to things. There's a sort of space around your reactions. Even, for example, if you're sitting and the person sitting next to you is talking loudly on the phone, and that's something that normally would irritate yourself, to suddenly find that it's happening, and you can even sense the irritation arising, but it's surrounded by that spaciousness. It's not overwhelmed by it, because if it becomes overwhelmed by it, then I become angry.
And there's a choice then.
And there is a choice then, and hopefully the choice is to carry on sitting in that spaciousness.
Without reactivity.
Without letting it overwhelm one. And it's that brings the wisdom, because one then one does have that choice. Not only does that have one choice, one can actually see what this is. One then knows when to respond and how to respond in a human way, rather than in a sort of in an impulsive way.
Okay, and maybe moving on to sort of very practical things now. So if someone was to do seated meditation or Zazen, there's kind of two real ways to do it, really, which is be sort of the traditional seated meditation on a cushion, or on a mat. In the Japanese school, they have what's called a zabuton, which is like a square cushion that sits on like a mat that's on the floor, and then like a round cushion that sits on top called like a hard...
A zafu.
A zafu.
Sorry, the zabuton is the fold... It's a small square, but it's folded over and you sit on it. And that raises your buttocks up. So you're sitting on the square mat, which is on the floor, which I don't know the name of, actually.
This one.
Yes, that one. But this is more like a zabuton, where you then fold it over. So the zafu and the zabuton lift your buttocks off the floor, which is what you usually find. And sometimes people use little benches as well. You come across. And really the idea, whether you're sitting on the floor in a cross-legged position, or whether you're kneeling, which is with the knees apart, the important thing is that your hips should be higher than your knees. Now, a lot of people, although this isn't so much done in the East, but here in the West, a lot of people can't really sit very well on the floor, because we're not used to it. And so people sit on chairs, which is absolutely fine. That is, in all the years I've been sitting, and I sit on a chair now anyway, having sat on a cushion for a long time. It's not second league or anything. But the important thing again is that I've noticed, particularly with tall people, is that they don't sit high enough. You need to make sure your hips are higher than your knees. If you do that, then your pelvis goes forward, and your back maintains that nice S shape. If you're sitting too low and you relax, then your back goes like an archer's bow. It sort of distends, and you're constantly pulling yourself up, and it does put a strain on the lower back. So if you're sitting high enough, and obviously if you're sitting on a zafu or a zabuton, or you're sitting high enough on a chair, then you should be able to relax the upper body, and it maintains that good posture, and you can just relax into that, because with each breath that you take, when you relax into it, and this is, I always say to people who are starting, don't worry about the count to begin with. Just notice your breath, notice the out breath for half a dozen cycles, and then just relax into it, almost like as if you were descending in a lift or getting into a hot bath on a cold day, that sort of as each breath goes right out to the very end, so that you develop that sinking into the body feeling, and each out breath takes you a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper, and from that, then that opening out happens quite naturally. I don't have to force it or try to force it.
And it's often quite good then to ground the body at that point by sort of scanning the body, going into the blood flow and the heartbeat and so on, just to kind of bring the attention back to the body as a whole, and remind yourself that it is the whole of you that is sitting, and not just the bit between the top of the nose and the top of the head.
Yes, exactly. And if that body awareness is there, then things like sleep or leaning over to one side, these things are picked up a little bit more. And actually, it's a wonderful thing. I mean, to be able to just relax into one's own body, or into one's own body mind. There's a lovely quote from Sokian, who was the Japanese Zen master who lived in New York for many years in the 1930s, and he taught there, set up the first Zen Institute in America in New York. And he wrote once, he said, I've been invited to go on holiday with some friends. They want to take me to their house in the country. He said, but in the end, he said, I decided to stay here in my little room in New York and just enjoy my own mind. Which I thought was a lovely, I mean, how many people can honestly say that they're quite happy just to sit in a room and enjoy the pleasures of their own mind?
Not me quite yet.
It's certainly something. Then we know we've really got our Zazen strength.
Absolutely. Okay, so once we have that strength, then you were going to. I know we talked before we started recording today, and you were mentioning a little bit about the sense of the eternal changes the usual categories of reality. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe that's more of an outcome.
Okay. Yeah. Well, obviously, as we go deeply into that quiet, much of the categories, or by that I mean the way that we see things, begins to change quite naturally of itself. I mean, you've mentioned it already. When we reach that point where we realise that I am not the thoughts, and the thinker falls away, literally the thinker falls away, suddenly we realise that in that absence there is that spacious emptiness. And even when we come back to the thinker, we realise that the thoughts and the thinker is contained within that spaciousness. Whereas before, I was convinced that I was that, little nub or complex of thoughts.
Well, because it dominates, doesn't it?
Because it totally does. It is the whole world.
Executive chair, isn't it?
And we experience it as the whole world. We experience the whole world through it. So in its absence, suddenly we realise that there's a sort of things are just as they are. In Buddhism, the term is tathata, which means thus, or thus comes. So things are thus. There's a thusness about them, just as it is, which is different to the Do I like this? Is it like the one I've got at home? Is this desk like the one I've got at home? Yeah, is it better? Is it worse? Yeah. Is Jamie earning more money than me or less money than me? So everything comes with a sort of condition attached to it. It doesn't exist in its thusness. Once all that has fallen, which was all the thinking in the categories, once all that has fallen away, then the essential thusness is suddenly realised. And this is what I was meaning with that. I call that the eternal, because it's ever present. It's the ever present now, and when that is entered into, or when that is realised a little bit more, then the usual categories of reality, like inside and outside, and me and you, etc., fall away. And then even when we return back to those categories, as we do, we don't forget, that somehow we bring a little bit of that perfume of the eternal comes back with us into the phenomenal as well, and things are not quite the same. And it's a gradual thing. I would say there are obviously in Zen, awakening happens suddenly, but there's often very little shifts that happen, and when we go on retreat, we suddenly re-experience insights that we had forgotten quite often as well. But each time they go a little bit more deeper, and they begin to join up a little bit more as well. The dots get joined together.
Yeah. It's very interesting hearing what you have to say about thusness, because it reminds me of a few years ago, actually. I can't remember if it was Channel 4 or the Beeb, who were doing a Richard Dawkins series, series of specials on Richard Dawkins' great mind. And I say that with some sarcasm, because in some level I think that the man he's obviously brilliant, in his discussions around evolutionary psychology and so on, but he really didn't have any understanding of this idea of ness and thusness and so on. And this is a classic example of where a top intellectual mind has not got that clarity, because they're so dominated by their conceptual thinker and their intellect that they're literally oblivious to what lies beneath. And in some ways, my sympathies are with some of his arguments, because I think some of the religions and what they espouse in their modern institutional way of putting things is laughable and dangerous. And if that's what he's attacking in his kind of anti-religion, I think fair enough. But at the same time, there was a line where someone asked him, I said, well, what do you think about Buddhism? He said, I don't know anything about Buddhism. As if to sort of say that it's maybe in some kind of a different category or something like that. But he didn't know, and somebody said to him, it was an Indian teacher of meditation, about they were talking about different items, and they said, well, what about this rock? He says, yes, this is a rock, and it has rock nests. And he got really pulled apart by Dawkins for that. But I really saw how Dawkins didn't have any idea about that at all. And I think
it's an experiential thing, though.
Yeah,
it's not an intellectual thing. I mean, it's something that one experiences. And here I will now use another word that Richard Dawkins would probably tear me apart from as well. In the depths of one's soul, or in the depths of one's heart of hearts, it's that's where it exists. And it's interesting, because when those things come up, there is that feeling that somehow this has always been known. And it has that mark about it, even though I cannot explain why. But often that's how it's experienced.
Because it's authentic.
Yeah. Yes.
The heart knows home when it sees it.
And and again, this goes back to what you were saying about the thinker falling away. We are. It's not just that we're aware of our thoughts. We're aware of some of our thoughts, but we're not aware just how ingrained they are into the way we experience and what we call reality as well. So when that falls away, that's why it can be so very traumatic, actually, in a good way, usually.
Positive trauma.
Positive trauma. Although not always, I have to say. Sometimes it can happen spontaneously and it can be quite devastating. But
that's often when it's misunderstood and
yes.
they don't have a teacher to help them process it.
And they've not been softened up for the experiences beforehand, and lack the framework within which to process it, which helps. So it can be very traumatic, and because it is so revolutionary, but it's a revolution that happens in one's own psyche, rather than outwardly in the world.
So how long should people meditate for every day?
I would say for people who are starting out, sit for 10 minutes. And if you could do that 5 times a week, good. Get up to, try and build up to half an hour. If you're following a Buddhist practice, you probably find that quite a lot of practitioners aim to sit for about an hour regularly, 5-6 times a week. Certainly in the group that we come from, it's an hour 6 times a week. But this is obviously countered by daily life practice as well. So quite often what we find is that in daily life practice issues come up, and then in meditation they can be looked at a little bit more. Once you've developed that stamina, then and you can sit in that quiet spaciousness, it's possible to, if a certain situation is causing a problem or bothersome, you can allow that issue to come up in the meditation, and it can be turned over and looked at it from a 360-degree angle. And quite often we find the solution pops out in that meditation.
Unconscious search.
Yeah.
And so for those of us terrestrials who are doing well, you're looking at about an hour a day. And it's interesting that you say 6 days a week, because we actually take a day off from time to time.
We do indeed. It's a good thing. Yeah, well, it's not just a matter of all work and no play, but also, again, so one doesn't become too reliant on it. Some people start getting a bit of a high with meditation and then get a little bit addicted to it. So it's good to have a break from it as well, so one doesn't become... Always in Buddhism, it's about letting go.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's very interesting for our listeners to think then, well, what's the next level up from there? So my experience in a Zen temple was that the monks and nuns would sit for 2 hours of an evening, which is sort of 7:30 to 9:30, of 4 lots of half an hour, interspersed with sort of maybe 1 or 2 minutes to get the blood flow back in the legs.
That's
and so
right,
on.
yes.
So 2 hours a day would be quite a profound change over time, which then begs the question, well, what do you do with the rest of the day?
During the rest of the day, you're practicing daily life practice. So what we call daily life practice is very much, it's meditation and activity.
Please see our earlier podcast on daily life
meditation.
Earlier
podcast on daily life practice and working with the body for all that. But this is, it's very much, 2 legs. This practice walks on 2 legs. One is daily life practice and the other is Zazen. And
it's very much a synergy, and one energizes the other.
Yes.
And if you're not doing it on the cushion, it won't work in daily life.
Yeah, and this is true with whichever school you go to. I remember one of the Theravada monks from Amravati saying, he said, when people come up to me and say, I'm having a problem sitting meditation, I always ask them, how's the precept practice going? Precept practice forms the mainstay for the daily life practice in the Theravada school for lay people and monks alike. So the two are very much interrelated.
Good. Okay, so I think we've covered an awful lot there.
I think so.
Thanks again, Martin.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you again, which will be Zen Bites 12 next time, won't
Zen
it?
Bites 12, the big dozen.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and I think maybe a good way to end this would be just to say, do go back now after having listened to this podcast and have a listen to some of the ones we've done before, because they really are, there's a synergy there with different ones. So you can listen to our last one on body and breath, there's a daily life practice, and hopefully these free podcasts do have a purpose to them, is that you can build up a picture and join the dots up of the whole thing over time. If you've enjoyed this, do listen to the others and recommend them to others as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so that completes another Zen Bites, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. But in the meantime, if you would like to check out either of our websites, you can go to the zengateway.com website for the Zen Bites community, or you can go to Jamie's individual website, www.jamieshavdia.co.